On May 12th of 1846, they rolled out of Independence, Missouri, believing they were doing something brave, something practical, and something very American. The wheels creaked, the oxen strained, and the children fidgeted, and the grown-ups looked west with the kind of confidence that only people looking to start a new future could really afford. They were not setting out to become a byword for starvation. They were not leaving home to become a story whispered with a grimace of campfires and dinner tables for generations. They were leaving because California sounded like a promise. It was a better land. It was better chances, better weather, better future. That's what makes the Donner Party so chilling. It did not begin as a horror story. It began as a family road trip. And that family road trip, looked normal enough, at least by the standards of the 1840s. The Donner brothers, George and Jacob, traveled with their wives, their children, and their hired hands. James Reed came with his wife, his children, his mother-in-law, and the heavy confidence of a man used to making all of the decisions for all of these people. Other families joined them along the way, including the Breens, the Graveses, the Murphys, the Eddies, and others. Each wagon holding not just supplies, but its own set of private dreams. Some wanted lands. Some wanted a healthier climate for those who might be suffering from things like tuberculosis. Some wanted money. Some wanted a clean break from everything behind them. They were not foolish people in the cartoon sense. These were just people. People with incomplete information, limited time, and a dangerous faith in an idea that a shortcut would save them. The shortcut, of course, was called the Hastings Cutoff, a name that sounded now like a joke told by the devil. But Lansford Hastings at the time had promoted a supposedly quicker route to California, and like many men who made grand promises from a comfortable distance, he was much better at selling the idea than he was at guaranteeing the results. He'd barely tested the route himself, at least not in a meaningful way, for a large wagon train, but that did not stop him from encouraging these families to trust him. So trust him they did. Instead of staying on the better-known trail, the Donner Party turned toward a route that showed them the Wasatch Range. This is where they lost precious time hacking wagons through a terrain that should have warned everyone that the plan was rotten. Trees had to be cut. Rocks had to be moved. Wagons had to be lowered by hand down sheer rock faces. Men sweated and argued while women and children watched the clock of the season tick louder and louder. Then came the Great Salt Lake disaster, and this is where the journey starts to feel less like a migration and more like a punishment. Hastings had implied that the crossing would be hard, yes, but manageable. What the Donner Party found instead was a killing floor of heat, salt, thirst, confusion, and absolute exhaustion. Their wheels sank, their cattle weakened, their water disappeared. Men drove animals forward until beasts broke, staggered, or completely vanished. Families abandoned wagons and possessions not because they were careless, but because the weight had become an enemy to them. Time, too, had become an enemy. By the time they crawled back to the main route, they had not saved time at all. They had wasted the one thing they absolutely could not afford to lose. And still, even after that, California remained possible. That's another cruel detail to the story. They were not doomed from the first day. They were doomed inch by inch and decision by decision and delay by delay. If they had made better time earlier on, if the shortcut had not cost them literally weeks, if one thing or another had broken in their favor, maybe the Sierra Nevada would have opened to them like just another challenge. But mountains don't care about maybe, maybe, maybe. By the time the party reached the Sierra, snow had come before they could clear the pass. At Truckee Lake, now Donner Lake, some of the families huddled into cabins. Farther away at Alder Creek, the Donner families ended up in miserable shelters. and some of them intense. And the snow kept falling. The pass was closed, and the world narrowed into a white prison. And this is where the real psychological horror begins, because starvation is not one dramatic moment. It's a long time thief. First, it takes your energy, then it takes your patience, and then your judgment. Eventually, it steals your dignity. At Truckee Lake, as I said, now Donner Lake, the cabins became cramped and filthy. There were too many bodies and not nearly enough room. There was certainly not enough food, definitely not enough warmth, and definitely not enough clean air. The roofs leaked, the clothing wore thin. Their children cried, and then whimpered, and then stopped making much noise at all. Oxhide was boiled down into a sticky mess and eaten. Bones were boiled and reboiled until there was almost nothing left to draw from them. Leather was softened and chewed. Belt leather, shoe leather. Every meal became a negotiation with disgust. Every day became a fresh insult. And as if that weren't enough, sickness and weakness and death, they didn't wait their turn. They came together as a crowd. Older people failed first, and the very young slipped next. The strong became merely weak, and the weak became helpless. Men who had once driven wagons and argued about routes now lay under blankets, too tired to stand. Women who had held families together had to watch their children hollow before their eyes. In stories of survival, people often like to imagine some grand speech, some noble resolve, some heroic tightening of the jaw. This is what we see in the movies. But most survival, it looks so much uglier than that, especially if you go through it. It looks like trying to keep a fire lit with numb hands and like praying over scraps of hide. It looks like silence because everyone is too tired or too dead to talk. Eventually, some of them understood that waiting meant more death. So a small group strapped on makeshift snowshoes and attempted to cross the mountains on foot to search for help. Later generations called them the Forlorn Hope. And frankly, that may be the most accurate title anyone's ever given to anything. They set out in December with very little food and even less strength. 17 people in all, men and women and children, trying to drag themselves across a world buried under snow. Imagine that scene for a moment. There's wind in your face. There's snow swallowing every direction around you. Hunger has already been clawing at your insides before you've even gotten started. Some of them were already too weak when they got started, but staying behind meant waiting for starvation. Going forward meant gambling against the mountain. One way you gamble, the other way you're just waiting to die. And the mountain won, at least at first. They lost their trail. They lost time. They lost strength. And one by one, they lost their people. Men dropped. Storms hit. Some went snowblind. They discussed whether someone should die so that others could live. I mean, that's the kind of conversation that means the world you came from is already long gone. Then came the first death, and then another, and then another. And finally, the dead stopped being just dead. They became food. There's no general way to really phrase that, nor should there be. The survivors cut flesh from bodies that they had traveled beside and tried not to lose their minds while doing it. A few of them refused at first, and hunger changed that for some of them, but for others it never really did. But mortality in a starving body becomes a very different battlefield, and so does morality. And then the story grows darker still, if you can imagine, because the cannibalism did not end there, not neatly. not as a single awful chapter. People who often remember the Donner Party as though one horrifying decision was made in one terrible moment, and that was that. But the truth is far messier and far more disturbing. The Forlorn Hope group stumbled onward, feeding on their dead when they had no other choice until even that supply vanished. Later, two Native American men traveling with them became the focus of suspicion and fear. William Foster eventually shot them, and their bodies were also eaten. That particular act has sat like a hot coal inside the story ever since, because now hunger was not merely consuming those who had died. It had crossed into something even more morally savage. Survival had stopped asking for permission. Now they were just taking. When the first survivors of Forlorn Hope finally reached help, they did not arrive like conquering heroes. They arrived half dead. They were frostbitten, haunted. They were carrying news so awful that even people hardened by frontier life recoiled from them. Rescue parties had been assembled, and that sounds encouraging until you realize what rescue in the Sierra winter actually meant. It meant climbing into deep snow with limited food, trying to reach people who might already be gone. It meant not having enough strength to carry everyone. It meant deciding which children to take first and which adults had to be told to wait for the next attempt. And it meant salvation arriving in installments, each one too small and too late to really feel clean. The first relief party reached Truckee Lake and found a world that barely resembled ordinary life anymore. Cabins were buried in snow, and the smell was awful. The people inside were far too weak to greet the rescuers properly, and the bodies had been tucked into snowdrifts or lay half hidden in the snow just outside. The rescuers had to ration food carefully because a starving person can die if they eat too much very quickly. Even rescue had to be measured in little bites. The strongest children, of course, were taken first. Some of the adults came out too, and often the others were left behind with promises that more help would return. But one mother had to walk away from children who were too weak to travel. Imagine hearing your own child ask if you're going to come back. And you say yes, because the alternative is to admit that even you don't know. Those rescue marches down the mountain were far from triumphant. They were death walks with a thin layer of hope thrown over them. People collapsed on the trails. One child died during the rescue attempt. Frostbitten feet bled through rags wrapped around them. The rescuers themselves ran out of food. At one point, starving survivors and rescuers together scraped at whatever they could chew. The landscape gave them no mercy. Snowdrifts did not care that these were mothers, fathers, or little children. Every mile was paid for, sometimes with the price of blood. Sometimes it was a body left behind with the expectation that another rescue would handle it. Sometimes it was the knowledge that if the next rescue did not come fast enough, the people you left in the cabins would have no choice but to eat the dead again. And that happened. This is the detail that many people so often, when they tell the story, skip right over it. But it does matter. Cannibalism was not one isolated event during one march by one desperate group, but it appeared again in the camps as food vanished and death lingered all around them. Starved Camp, as one of the later sites became known, was exactly as horrific as the name might suggest. Men, women, and children were stranded there. They were too weak to proceed, too hungry to think clearly, and desperately waiting for the next rescue. Some died before it arrived, and the ones still living did what the ones before them had done. They used the dead to postpone joining them. That's the ugliest truth of the Donner story. Rescue and cannibalism existed side by side. Hope did not erase horror in some cases. All it did was prolong it. At Alder Creek, the Donner camp had its own layer of misery. George Donner had suffered from an infected hand that had worsened until it effectively doomed him. Tamsin Donner, his wife, had chances to leave with rescuers but refused to abandon her husband. That decision has echoed through history because it shows love in its most loyal and most tragic form. She could have walked out, but she stayed. Their children, meanwhile, became bargaining chips against time and weather. Some of them were eventually brought away. Tamsin remained with George. Later accounts suggest she made it to another camp and died there after his death. Her exact remains are one of the many grim little fog banks inside the larger catastrophe. We don't know where she is, but we know enough. She chose her husband over the possibility of saving herself. That kind of devotion sounds noble until you remember the setting was a winter graveyard, and she knew it. The final rescues were not heroic in the tidy storybook sense either. Some parties turned back before reaching the trapped immigrants. Others simply could not do more. By the time the last people were found, the survivors were scarcely human in appearance. Keysburg was discovered near a pot containing human remains, which ensured that history would never stop staring at him specifically. Whether every accusation made against him was fair is still debated. But by then, fairness had become almost impossible. Every survivor carried suspicion and guilt and grief, most of them a combination of all three. And the dead, of course, carried nothing at all. When it was over, fewer than half of the original party survived. Families that had rolled cheerfully west in the spring were broken into pieces by the following year. Parents were gone. Children were orphaned. Husbands and wives had been separated by death, snow, or impossible choices. Some survivors rebuilt their lives in California. They married again, they had children, they ran businesses, they attended churches, and they did all the normal things that people do after a catastrophe because ordinary life had a rude habit of continuing. But none of them really escaped that winter. How could you? How do you sit down to supper for the rest of your life and not remember the winter when supper became someone you loved, someone you knew, someone you had just buried badly in the snow? And then there's another layer to the story that makes it even more chilling in hindsight. The Donner Party was not destroyed by the wilderness alone. It was destroyed by optimism, by salesmanship, by the human habit of hearing what we want to hear. California was real. The opportunity was real. But so was the danger of trusting shortcuts offered by men who did not have to suffer alongside you. Langsford Hastings did not freeze in those cabins. He did not boil oxhide. He did not watch children wither and die. He offered a vision and then let others pay its cost. If there's a villain here besides hunger and winter, it may be misplaced confidence wrapped in a cheerful language in the name of Hastings. What lingers with me most is not even the cannibalism, as awful as it was. It's the rescue attempts. It's the repeated terrible act of deciding who would go and who would wait. It's the mothers leaving children behind in cabins. The rescuers arriving with hope in one hand and impossibility in the other. It's the knowledge that survival was not handed out to the worthiest or the strongest in any fair sense. Sometimes it went to the lucky, sometimes to the young, sometimes to the ones who happened to be standing when the rescuers walked in. That randomness makes the story feel even crueler. If there had been a clean moral logic to it, maybe people could make peace with it, but there was not. There was just weather, hunger, timing, and human endurance, stretching on until it snapped. By the time the story traveled east, it horrified the nation. Newspaper readers fixated on the cannibalism because, of course, they did. That's the detail that burns itself into your memory. But the real power of the Donner Party story is not simply that they ate the dead, it's that they reached the point through a chain of ordinary decisions. A later departure, a shortcut, lost time, bad weather, pride, delay. By the time cannibalism appeared, the catastrophe had already been built plank by plank, like one of their wagons. What people remember as a ghastly ending was actually the final consequence of many earlier choices. That's probably why the Donner Party still unsettles us so much. It's not a story about monsters in the woods. It's a story about families, about children, about practical people who thought they were managing risk and improving their future. It's a story about how civilization thins out when food disappears and rescue is uncertain. It's a story that takes all of the shiny language of westward hope and drags it into a cabin with no proper roof where somebody is boiling leather, or maybe a person, and somebody else is pretending not to notice the body in the snow outside. So when we think of the Donner Party, we should not picture only one infamous meal or one grotesque headline. We should picture the whole terrible progression, the bright departure from Missouri, the false promise of the shortcut, the desert that stole time, the snow that shut the door, the cabins shrinking into tombs, and the snowshoe party walking out into the white death, the rescue parties choosing who might live, the campfires around which people prayed, despaired, and finally crossed lines they once could not have imagined crossing, because that is the real story. Not just cannibalism and not just hardship, but the slow collapse of the normal life until the only thing left was the raw, stubborn, frightening will to keep breathing one more day. And maybe that's why the Donner Party is such a lasting American nightmare. It was a journey sold as progress that ended in survival so brutal, it barely looked like victory. California waited in the end, yes, but by the time many of them got there, the promised land must have looked very different. Gold, soil, sunshine, opportunity, all of that had to compete with memory. And memory, unlike snow, does not melt when spring arrives. So here's the question I want you to answer in the comments, and I really do want to hear your thoughts on this one especially. At one point in the catastrophe like this, do you think a person stops living by the rules that they were raised with and starts living only by the rules of survival? And of course, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the History Happens Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments, and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Every subscriber helps.